Good morning. Welcome back from your Thanksgiving vacation. When we last left them, they were, remember the Kalkara, those beasts, were loose, and they are gonna go get them. They're sending word back to the castle for the knights, but the Galan, Halt, and Will, the three rangers, are gonna go after them. So here we go. The camp buzzed with activity as tents came down and rangers repacked their equipment and tied on their saddlebags. Already, the first few riders had departed, heading back to their own fiefs. Will was fastening the ties on their saddle packs, having replaced a few items that he had taken out. Halt sat a few meters away, frowning thoughtfully as he studied a map of the area surrounding the solitary plain. The plain itself was a vast unmapped area with no roads and a few features indicated. A shadow fell across him and he looked up. Galan stood there, a worried look on his face. "Halt," he said in a low, concerned voice. "Are you sure about this?" Halt met his gaze steadily. "Very sure, Galan. It simply has to be done." "But he's a boy," Galan protested, looking quickly to where Will was tying a pack roll back in place behind Tug's saddle. Halt let go a long breath, his eyes dropping from Galan's as he spoke. "I know, but he's a ranger. Apprentice or not, he's a member of the Corps, like all of us." He saw that Galan was about to protest further out of concern for Will, and he felt a surge of affection for his old apprentice. "Galan, in an ideal world, I wouldn't put him at risk like this. But this isn't an ideal world. Everyone's going to have to play his part in this campaign, even boys like Will. Morgrath is preparing for something big. Crowley's agents have got wind that, on top of everything else, he's been in touch with the Scandians." "The Scandians? What for?" Halt shrugged. "We don't know the details, but my bet is he's hoping to form an alliance with them. They'll fight anyone for money, and apparently they'll fight for anyone as well," he added, his distaste for mercenaries obvious in his voice. "The point is, we're short-handed enough while Crowley tries to raise the army. Normally I wouldn't go after the Kalkara with a force less than 5 senior rangers, but he simply can't spare them for me. So I've had to settle for the two I trust most, you and Will." Galan grinned crookedly. "Well, thanks for that, anyway." He was touched by Halt's confidence. He still looked up to his old mentor. Most of the Ranger Corps did. "Besides, I thought that rusty old sword of yours might come in handy if we run into those horrors," Halt said. The Ranger Corps had chosen wisely when they allowed Galan to continue his training with the weapon. Although very few people knew it, Galan was one of the finest swordsmen in Arielon. "As for Will," Halt continued, "don't sell him short. He's very resourceful. He's quick and brave and a good shot already. Best of all, he thinks quickly. My real thinking is that if we get on the trail of the Kalkara, we can send him for reinforcements. That'll help us and keep him out of harm's way." Galan scratched his chin thoughtfully. Now that Halt had explained it, it seemed the only logical course for them to take. He met the older man's eyes and nodded his understanding of the situation. Then he turned to organize his own kit, only to find that Will had already repacked it and tied it to his saddle. He smiled at Halt. "You're right," he said. "He does think for himself." The three of them rode out a little while later, while the other rangers were still receiving their orders. Mobilizing the Arelon army would be no small task, and it would be the rangers' jobs to coordinate it, and then be ready to guide the individual forces from the 50 fiefs to their assembly point at the plains of Uthal. With both Galan and Halt assigned to searching for the Kalkara, other rangers had to be tasked with coordinating the forces from their fiefs as well. There was little said between the three companions as Halt led the way to the southwest. Even Will's natural curiosity was subdued by the magnitude of the task ahead of them. As they rode in silence, his mind's eye kept conjuring images of savage bear-like creatures with the feature of apes, creatures that might well prove to be invincible, even for someone of Halt's skill. Eventually, however, as monotony set in, the horrific images receded, and he began to wonder what plan, if any, Halt had in mind. "Halt," he said, a little breathlessly, "where do you hope to find the Kalkara?" Halt looked at the serious young face beside him. They were traveling at the Rangers' forced march pace, 40 minutes in the saddle, riding at a steady canter, and then 20 minutes on foot, leading the horses and allowing them to travel unburdened, while the men ran at a steady trot. Every 4 hours they would pause for 1 hour's rest, when they ate a quick meal of dried meat, hard bread, and fruit, and then rolled into their cloaks to sleep. They had been leading the horses for some time now, and Halt judged that it was time to rest. He led Abelard off the road and into the shelter of a grove of trees. Will and Galan followed, dropping the reins and allowing their horses to graze. "The best way I can think of," Halt said, and in answer to Will's question, "is to start at their lair and see if they're in the vicinity." "Do we know where that is?" Galan asked. "Best intelligence we have is that it's somewhere on the solitary plain beyond the stone flutes. We'll scout around that area and see what we can find. If they're in the area, we should find that the odd sheep or goat is going missing from villages nearby. Although getting the villagers themselves to talk will be another matter. Plains people are a closed-mouthed bunch, or at the best of times." "Well, what's this plain you're talking about?" Will asked through a mouthful of hard bread. "And what on earth is a stone flute?" "The solitary plain is a vast flat area. Very few trees, mainly covered in rock outcrops and long grass," Halt told him. "The wind seems to always be blowing, no matter what time of year you go there. It's a dismal, depressing place, and the stone flutes are the most dismal part of it." "But what are—" Will began, but Halt had only paused briefly. "The stone flutes? Nobody really knows. They're a circle of standing stones built by the ancients, smack in the middle of the windiest part of the plain. Nobody has ever worked out their original purpose, but they're arranged in such a way that the wind is deflected around the circle and through a series of holes in the stones themselves. They create a constant keening sound, although why anyone thought that sounded like flutes is beyond me. The sound is eerie and discordant, and you can hear it from kilometers away. After a few minutes, it sets your teeth on edge, and it goes on and on for hours." Will was silent. The thought of a dismal, windswept plain and stones that emitted a nonstop keening wail seemed to take the last verge of warmth from the late afternoon sun. He shivered involuntarily. Halt saw the movement and leaned forward to clap him on the shoulder encouragingly. "Cheer up," he said. "Nothing's ever as bad as it sounds. Now let's get some rest." They reached the outskirts of the solitary plain by noon the second day. Halt was right. Will thought it was a vast, depressing place. The featureless ground stretched out before them for kilometers after kilometer, covered in tall gray grass, made rank and dry by the constant wind. The wind itself almost seemed to be a living presence. It rubbed on their nerves, blowing constantly and unvaryingly from the west, bending the tall grass before it as it swept across the flat ground of the solitary place. "Now you can see why they call it the solitary place," Halt said to the two of them, reining Abelard in so they could come abreast of him. "When you ride out into this wind, you feel as if you're the only person left alive on Earth." It was true, Will thought. He felt small and insignificant against the emptiness of the plain, and with the feeling of insignificance came an accompanying feeling of impotence. The wasteland they were riding across seemed to hint at the presence of arcane forces far greater than his own capabilities. Even Galan, normally cheerful and ebullient, seemed affected by the heavy, depressing atmosphere of this place. Only Halt seemed unchanged, remaining grim and taciturn as ever. Gradually, as they rode, Will became aware of a disquieting sensation. Something was lurking just outside the range of his conscious perception. Something that made him feel uneasy. He couldn't isolate it, couldn't even tell where it was coming from or what form it took. It was just there, ever present. He shifted in his saddle, standing in the stirrups to scan the featureless horizon in the hopes that he might see the source of it all. Halt noticed the movement. "You've noticed them," he said. "It's the stones." And now that Halt said it, Will realized that it had been a sound, so faint and so continuous that he couldn't isolate it as such, that had been creating the sense of unease in his mind and the tight cramping of fear in the pit of his stomach. Or perhaps it was just that as Halt had said it, they came into the proper earshot of the stone flutes. Because now he could isolate it. It was an unmelodic series of musical notes all being played at once, but creating a harsh, discordant sound that jangled the nerves and unsettled the mind. His left hand crept unobtrusively to the hilt of his sax knife as he rode, and he drew comfort from the solid, dependable touch of the weapon. They rode on through the afternoon, never seeming to advance across the empty, featureless plain. With each pace their horse took, the horizon behind them and before them seemed to be neither recede nor draw closer. It was as if they were marking time in an empty world. The constant keening sound of the stone flutes was with them all day, growing gradually stronger as they traveled. It was the only sign that they were making progress. The hours passed and the sound continued, and Will found it no easier to bear. It wore at his nerves, keeping him constantly on edge. As the sun began to sink at the western rim, Halt reined Abelard in. "We'll rest for the night," he announced. "It's almost impossible to maintain a constant course in the dark. Without any significant land features to set a course by, we could easily wind up going around in circles." Gratefully, the others dismounted. Fit as they were, the hours spent at forced march pace had left them bone-weary. Will began scouting around the few stunted bushes that grew on the plain, searching for firewood. Halt, realizing what was on his mind, shook his head. "No fire," he said. "We'd be visible for miles, and we have no idea who might be watching." Will paused, letting the small bundle he had gathered fall to the ground. "You mean the Kalkara?" he said. Halt shrugged. "Them, or plains people. We can't be sure that some of them aren't in the league with the Kalkara. After all, living cheek by jowl with creatures like that, you might well end up cooperating with them, just to ensure your own safety. And we don't want them getting word that there are strangers on the plain." Galan was unsaddling Blaze, his bay horse. He dropped the saddle to the ground and rubbed the horse down with a handful of ever-present dry grass. "You don't think we've already been seen?" he asked. Halt considered the question for a few seconds before answering. "We might have been. There are just too many unknowns here, like where the Kalkara actually have their lair, whether or not the plains people are their allies, whether or not any of them have seen us and reported our presence. But until I know we haven't been seen, we'll assume we haven't. So, no fire." Galan nodded reluctantly. "You're right, of course," he said. "It's just I'd happily kill someone for a cup of coffee." "Light a fire to brew it," Halt told him, "and you might end up having to do just that." Chapter 26. It was a cold, cheerless camp. Tired from the hard pace they had been keeping up, and the Rangers ate a cold meal, bread, dried fruit, and cold meat once more, washed down with cold water from their canteens. Will was beginning to hate the sight of the virtually tasteless hard rations they carried. Then Halt took the first watch as Will and Galan rolled themselves into their cloaks and slept. It wasn't the first rough camp that Will had endured since training period began, but this was the first time there wasn't the slight comfort of a crackling fire or at least a bed of warm coals to sleep by. He slept fitfully, uncomfortable dreams chasing through his subconscious, dreams of fearful creatures, strange and terrifying things that stayed just outside his consciousness, but close enough to the surface that he felt their presence and was unsettled by them. He was almost glad when Halt shook him gently awake for his watch. The wind was scudding clouds across the moon. The moaning song of the stones was stronger than ever. Will felt a weariness of spirit and wondered if the stones had been designed to wear people down like this. The long grass around them hissed a counterpoint to the far-off keening. Halt pointed to a spot in the heavens, indicating an angle of elevation for Will to remember. "When the moon reaches that angle," he told the apprentice, "turn over the watch to Galan." Will nodded, rousing himself and standing to stretch his stiff muscles. He picked up his bow and quiver and walked to the bush Halt had selected as a vantage point. Rangers on watch never stayed in the open by the campfire, but always moved away 10 or 20 meters and found a place of concealment. That way, strangers coming upon the campsite would be less likely to see them. It was one of the many skills Will had learned in his months of training. He took 2 arrows from the quiver and held them between the fingers of his bow hand. He would hold them thus for the 4 hours of his watch. If he needed them, there would be no excessive movement as he took an arrow from his quiver, movement that might alert an attacker. Then he flipped the cowl of his cloak over his head so he would merge with the irregular shape of the bush. His head and eyes scanned from side to side as Halt had taught him, changing focus constantly, from close to the campsite and out to the dim horizon around them. That way, his vision would not become fixated on one distance and one area, and he'd stand a better chance of seeing movement. From time to time, he turned slowly through a complete circle, scanning the entire ground around them, moving slowly to keep his own movement as imperceptible as possible. The keening of the stones and the hissing of the wind through the grass formed a constant background. But he began to hear other noises as well, the rustling of small animals in the grass and other less explicable sounds. With each one, his heart raced a little faster, wondering if this might be the Kalkara, creeping in on the sleeping figures of his friends. Once, he was convinced that he could hear the breath of a heavy animal, Fear rose up in him, clutching at his throat, until he realized, with his senses tuned to the utmost degree, he could actually hear his companions breathing quietly in their sleep. He knew that from any more than 5 meters away, he would be virtually invisible to the human eye thanks to the cloak, the shadows, and the shape of the bush around him. But he wondered if the Kalkara depended on sight alone. Perhaps they had other senses that would tell them that there was an enemy concealed in the bush. Perhaps, even now, they were moving closer, concealed by the long shifting grass, ready to strike. His nerves, already stretched beyond endurance by the stone flute's dismal song, urged him to spin around and identify the source of each new sound as he heard it. But he knew that to do so would be to reveal himself. He forced himself to move slowly, turning carefully until he faced the direction from which he thought the sound had come, assessing each new risk before discarding it. In the long hours of tense watching, he saw nothing but the racing clouds, the fleeting moon, and the undulating sea of grass that surrounded them. By the time the moon reached the preordained elevation, he was physically and mentally drained. He woke Galan to take over the watch, then rolled back into his cloak again. This time there were no dreams. Exhausted, he slept soundly until the gray light of dawn. They saw the stone flutes by mid-morning, a gray and surprising small circle of granite monoliths that stood at the top of a rise in the plain. Their elected course took the riders a kilometer or so to one side of the stones, and Will was content to go no closer. The depressing song was now louder than ever, ebbing and flowing on the tide of the wind. "Next flute player I meet," said Galan with grim humor, "I'm going to split his lip for him." They rode on, the kilometers passing beneath their horses' hooves, hour after hour, one the same as the next, with nothing new to see and always with the faint howl of the stones at their back, keeping their nerves on edge. The plainsman rose suddenly from the grass some 50 meters away from them. Small, dressed in gray rags and with long hair hanging unkempt to his shoulders, he glared at them through the mad eyes for several seconds. Will's heart had barely recovered from the shock of his sudden appearance when he was off, bent double and running through the grass, seeming to sink into it. Within seconds he had disappeared, swallowed by the grass. Halt was about to urge Abelard in pursuit, but he stopped. The arrow he had selected instantly and laid on the bowstring remained undrawn. Galan was all ready to shoot, his reactions every bit as sharp as Halt's. He too held his shot, looking curiously at his senior. Halt shrugged. "May mean nothing," he said. "Or maybe he's off to tell the Kalkara, but we can hardly kill him on suspicion." Galan let out a short bark of laughter, more to release the tension he felt as a result of the man's unexpected appearance. "I suppose there's no difference," he said, "whether we find the Kalkara or they find us." Halt's eyes fixed on him for a moment without any sign of answering humor. Believe me, Galan," he said. "There's a big difference." They had abandoned the forced march pace now and walked their horses slowly through the tall grass. Behind them, the sound of the stones began to fade a little, much to Will's relief. Now, he realized, the wind was carrying it away from them. Some time passed following the sudden appearance of the plain dweller with no further sign of life. A question had been nagging at Will all through the afternoon. "Halt," he said, experimentally, not sure if Halt would order him to silence. The ranger looked at him, eyebrows raised, in a sign that he was prepared to answer questions, so Will continued. "Why do you think Morgarath has enlisted the Kalkara? What does he stand to gain?" Halt realized that Galan was waiting for his answer as well. He marshaled his thoughts before he replied. He was a little reluctant to verbalize his thoughts, as so much of the answer depended on guesswork and intuition. "Who knows why Morgarath ever does anything?" he answered slowly. "I can't give you a definite answer. All I can tell you is that what I assume, and what Crowley thinks as well." He glanced quickly at his two companions. It was obvious from their expectant expressions that they were prepared to accept his assumptions as an ironclad fact. Sometimes, he thought wryly, a reputation for being right all the time could be a heavy burden. "There's a war coming," he went on. "That much is already obvious. The Wargles are on the move, and we've heard that Morgarath has been in contact with Ragnak." He saw the puzzled expression flit across Will's face. Galan, he knew, understood who Ragnak was. "Ragnak is the Oberjarl, or Supreme Lord, if you like, of the Scandians, the Sea Wolves." He saw the quick flash of comprehension and went on. This is obviously going to be a bigger war than we've fought before, and we're going to need all our reserves and resources and our best commanders to lead us. I think that's what Morgorath has in mind. He's seeking to weaken us by having the Kalkara kill our leaders. Northolt, the Supreme Army Commander, and Loriak, our best cavalry commander, have gone already. Certainly there will be other men who will step into those positions, but there will be inevitably some confusion in the changeover period, some loss of cohesion. I think that's what's behind Morgorath's plan. Galan said thoughtfully, "There's another aspect as well. Both those men were instrumental in his defeat last time. He's destroying our command structure and getting revenge at the same time." Halt nodded. "That's true, of course, and to a twisted mind like Morgorath's, revenge is a powerful motive." "So you think there'll be more killings?" Will asked, and Halt met his gaze steadily. "I think there'll be more attempts. Morgorath has sent them out twice with targets, and they've succeeded. I don't see any reason why they won't go after others. Morgorath has reason to hate a lot of people in the kingdom. The king himself, perhaps. Or maybe Baron Erold. He caused Morgorath some grief in the last war." "And so did you," Will thought, with a sudden flash of fear for his teacher. He was about to voice the thought that Halt might be a target, then realized that Halt was probably well aware of the fact himself. Galan was asking the older ranger another question. "One thing I don't understand, why do the Kalkara keep returning to their hideout? Why not just move from one victim to the next?" "I suppose that's one of the few advantages we do have," Halt said. "They're savage and merciless and more intelligent than wargles, but they're not human. They are totally single-minded. Show them a victim and they'll hunt him down and kill him or die themselves in the attempt. But they can only keep track of one victim at a time. Between killings, they'll return to their lair. Then Morgorath or one of his underlings will prime them for their next victim and they'll head out again. Our best hope is to intercept them on the way if they've been given a new target, or kill them in their lair if they haven't." Will looked for the 1,000th time at the featureless grass plain that lay before them. Somewhere out there, the two fearsome creatures were waiting, perhaps with a new victim already in mind. Halt's voice interrupted his train of thought. "Sun's going down," he said. "We may as well camp here." They swung down stiffly from their saddles, easing the girths to make their horses more comfortable. "That's one thing about this blasted place," Galan said, looking around them. "One spot as good as another to camp. Or as bad." Will woke from a dreamless sleep to the touch of Halt's hand on his shoulder. He tossed back the cloak, glanced at the scudding moon overhead, and frowned. He couldn't have been asleep for more than an hour. He started to say so, but Halt stopped him, placing a finger to his lips for silence. Will looked around and realized Galan was already awake, standing above him, his head turned to the northeast, back the way they had come, listening. Will came to his feet, moving carefully to avoid making any undue noise. His hands had automatically gone to his weapons, but he relaxed as he realized there was no immediate threat. The other two were listening intently. Then Halt raised a hand and pointed to the north. "There it is again," he said softly. Then Will heard it, above the moaning of the stone flutes and the soughing of the wind through the grass, and the blood froze in his veins. It was a high-pitched, bestial howl that ululated and climbed in pitch, an inhuman sound carried to them on the wind from the throat of a monster. Seconds later, another howl answered the first. Slightly deeper in pitch, it seemed to come from a position a little to the left of the first. Without needing to be told, Will knew what the sounds meant. It's the Kalkara," Halt said grimly. "They have a new target, and they're hunting." That's a perfect place to stop for today. All right, see you guys later. Have a good day.